Welcome to Didactic Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Board Study Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary. I'm a Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellow in the National Capital Region, and this is a podcast that I make to help myself and other CAPS Fellows study for their boards. But anybody who's interested in human development and child and adolescent mental health will likely also get a lot out of this. If you want to know how this podcast is produced, please see Episode 1. I tell you this because I'm using some AI to assist me with the content creation, and Episode 1 will explain some of the details as to how I do that. Even though I'm using AI, I want all the content in here to be considered to be my opinion and no one else's. I can't blame anyone else for it. This is Episode 4. In Episode 3, I explored Sigmund Freud's foray into explaining child development, but his ideas left a lot to be desired, especially given the fact that he spent very little time studying children. He also spent almost no time systematically testing any of his ideas, which remains the most damning criticism of his approach. But following Freud, there were many researchers who were trying to make sense of child development, and they used his ideas as their primary framework. And then they combined those with observations that they made while watching children develop. Among those who adopted the psychoanalytic approach was his daughter, Anna Freud, who has been called the mother of child psychoanalysis. But there are other mothers. Some of those include the developers of object relations, including Melanie Klein and Margaret Mahler. I'm going to discuss Freud, Klein, and Mahler together in this episode. Anna Freud was far more pragmatic than her father. Her father was primarily concerned with unconscious processes that arose in the id or the superego. Anna shifted attention to the ego itself. And she was one of the primary thinkers to develop what later was called ego psychiatry. Anna helped to identify that the external and social environment, instead of merely just these internal conflicts, are critically important factors when children are developing. So here's some of her contributions to psychodynamic theories of infancy. So Anna Freud was concerned primarily with child analysis, and she pioneered some techniques that adapted psychoanalytic methods to suit the developmental needs and styles of children. So she was one of the earlier developers of play therapy as a means to uncover these unconscious conflicts, these anxieties in young children that can come out in their play. Play for Anna Freud was a way that children dealt with these fears and anxieties, and they used their ego to master these anxieties. Unlike Melanie Klein, who I'm going to talk about next, Anna did not believe that the normal analytic technique of kind of like passively listening to free association and identifying transference and then making interpretations was an appropriate way to address children. Instead, what she would do is get down and start playing with them. So Anna and her work helped us to understand the differences between what might be called normal and abnormal development. And she really emphasized how the environmental factors like parenting, trauma, neglect contribute to either ego strength or ego impairment. Because she emphasized the importance of the ego, that's the conscious part of the personality, she was interested in how it mediated between our primitive impulses, also called the id, and our more kind of moral consciousness, which is the superego. She believed that if you have this nurturing and supportive environment, you can empower the ego to maintain balance between the demands of the id and the superego. Now, others, like Melanie Klein, which I'll get to in a minute, really speculated more about the id's role itself in generating these unconscious fantasies that were then realized in the child's play. Anna Freud was more likely to emphasize how these child's anxieties came out in their play and how you could reinforce their ego to help cope with these. Now, she helped to elaborate a lot of her father's defense mechanisms and talk about how they're used by children. So, for infants, really, there's not a lot to observe with their defense mechanisms if they have any. And some people say they do, but it's hard to see those. But as children become more social, as they begin to interact with parents, other kids, other adults, then you could start to see things. Things like splitting, which is basically dividing the world into stuff that's all good or all bad. In object relations, it has another connotation, but I'll get to that in a minute. Another thing you can see is what's called acting out. So a child expresses their emotions through their behavior rather than through words. So they act out their emotions. They don't say things like, I'm mad. They start screaming and hitting you. Another common defense mechanism, which is important, is repression. So repression is when we unconsciously push distressing content away from our conscious awareness. So supposedly repression, instead of suppression, which is consciously pushing distressing content away, repression is more important in children because they don't have the skills to kind of consciously push it away. So they repress it instead of suppress it. Then there's something called projection. And projection is where we kind of assume that others have the same emotions or motives that we have. So we project ourselves into someone else. Now, there's something else called introjection, which is kind of in the opposite direction. It's where we unconsciously take on aspects of others. We kind of adopt their values or their behaviors in order to reduce conflict. Projection, self in others. Introjection, others get incorporated into ourselves. And then there's regression. Now, regression is one of the more widely known defense mechanisms, and it's where someone appears to be reverting to kind of a more primitive stage of their development, or they become maybe more needy, or their behaviors look more childlike. At the same time that Anna Freud was developing her ego psychology, others were developing what came to be known as object relations. And object relations really kind of continued Sigmund Freud's emphasis on the unconscious processes that really define us, in his opinion. So, object relations theories, although rooted in Sigmund Freud, were really initially developed by Melanie Klein. And Melanie Klein emphasized the importance of early relationships as objects in shaping the personality of children. She focused on how infants internalize and represent others, kind of, and how they mix their own identities with that of others. And if they do this successfully, then it's going to help them later in life. The key concepts in object relations are, well, the object itself. So an object itself is sort of like an internal mental representation of significant other people or things in the environment, such as our caregivers. Infants gradually develop these objects through their interactions with these individuals. These objects can change over time. Then there's the actual relation with the object. So the relationship between the infant and their internalized ideal object can be like a positive, negative, or kind of oscillating back and forth between both. And they also have various degrees in which they merge their own identities with that object. It gets really complex. But let me get into a little bit of a technical summary of what Melanie Klein was proposing. She talks a lot about something called fantasy. And she argued that infants and young children possess this rich fantasy life. And it comes to life really soon after birth. Like it's one of the first things they start doing is having these fantasies. And she assumes that infants have this rather well-developed kind of pre-programmed set of narratives for understanding the world. So these fantasies, most of which are unconscious, I mean, when they're very young, they're pretty much all unconscious, but as they grow older, many of them remain unconscious. They shape the children's conscious perceptions of the world. They shape their actions on the world. And they determine how their relationships with others go. The first object that child is likely to have is going to be its mother, but more specifically, actually, the mother's breast or the bottle itself. So Klein posited that an infant's experiences with that breast, whether it's a good or a bad experience, form the basis of their later object relations. So that's a super important object in the beginning. She described children as kind of taking positions in relationship to the breast, which I'm going really to poorly define here, but I'm going to make an attempt. So the first position is a paranoid schizoid position. Now, Klein's ideas have been described kind of as dark because she thought a lot about what we might consider to be less desirable traits that children have. So she emphasized like greed, envy, or aggression, aka the like death instinct or thanatos. Whereas like Sigmund Freud had put more emphasis on like the pleasure principle, the life instinct, or eros. The paranoid schizoid position is a developmental stage that's characterized by an infant's experience of anxiety and fear. And because of this, the infant kind of splits an object, such as the mother's breast, into good and bad parts. And they do this in order to kind of manage the overwhelming anxieties associated with the stress of just being a baby and being very limited. So the only thing they can really do is good or bad. The baby either feels like protected and nourished or persecuted and angry toward the breast. The greatest fear that the infant has is the loss of the breast, and so this forms the basis of the infant's paranoia about the world. The next position that a child can take is called the depressive position. So the depressive position happens primarily when the child starts the weaning process, but then the oscillation between the depressive position and the paranoid schizoid position pretty much happen for the rest of a person's life. If a child successfully navigates the weaning process well, then they're going to have more like empathy and concern for others. The depressive position occurs because a child increasingly becomes aware of this object, the mother, which evolved from the breast, and then realizes that that's kind of a whole object. It's not a split object. So they have this unconscious guilt and remorse for their prior like destructive fantasies against that bad part of the object. They you could say they feel bad about thinking that mommy was bad. So no longer is the infant anxious about their own survival, like, am I going to survive? Am I going to get nourishment? But they start to feel anxiety about the survival of their primary object, or the mother. Once they develop this ability to kind of see the mother as a whole object, this can be generalized to other objects. And then throughout life, there's this kind of oscillation between the paranoid schizoid and the depressive positions in a kind of balance. And this balance can be maintained in part by something called projective identification. Projective identification is when an individual projects the unwanted parts of their self onto others. That's projection, right? But then it goes further. There's an identification process. So after the projection, whatever undesirable or split off part of the self that was projected becomes changed by the perceived interaction with that external object. So that split off part of the self undergoes an evolution. And then a person introjects or kind of unconsciously readopts that same characteristic, but in its morphed form. So in this way, kind of the line between identities of objects can get really blurred as people oscillate between these positions. So a child might even suppose, for example, that they can control external objects after they've projected onto them. And they might maintain this kind of delusion until they re-enter that depressive position and then kind of regret what they have done. Klein is very difficult. And while I've found Klein to be rather dense and difficult to understand, I find Margaret Mahler, on the other hand, to be quite a bit more palatable. Mahler appears to take a bit more of an empirical approach by incorporating more observations about how infants actually act and less speculation about their unconscious conflicts. Margaret Mahler was a psychiatrist and pediatrician who became a psychoanalyst, and she emphasized a process called separation and individuation during the first couple years of a child's life. She suggests that infants initially experience a state of symbiosis with the mother, and then they gradually develop a sense of self. And with that sense of self, they develop a kind of independence from the mother. The very first phase, right after birth, is called the autistic phase. And this is when infants are really just primarily focused on their own internal states. They're kind of relatively unaware of the external environment. Now, Mahler abandoned this phase later, instead just decided, well, we're going to go ahead and just start with phase 2, the symbiotic phase, partly because the autistic phase doesn't have a lot of utility. The symbiotic phase, which occurs from birth till about 5 months, is when the infant kind of experiences the state of fusion with their mother. They basically perceive the mother as an extension of themselves. They don't have a separate identity. Then, come around 5 months or so, they start to really differentiate themselves from mom and explore the environment a little bit more. When they start this separation, in the separation individuation phase at 5 months, they can go through various kinds of processes. Mahler called these subphases. And the subphases are hatching, practicing, rapprochement, and consolidation. The first subphase is called hatching. In hatching, the infant will do things like protest when they are separated from their mother. They kind of have this awareness suddenly that the mother is a separate thing that can leave or come back to me. Then subphase 2 starts around 9 months, where they start practicing independence. They've got some increased mobility. They start to explore the environment more independently, but they don't go too far. If they suspect mom's not very close, they'll immediately start to cry for help. But they're doing more on their own. They're venturing farther away. They're kind of testing limits, developing a little bit of autonomy. In this phase, the practicing phase, the parents really still kind of the most important thing. They're seen as being the most powerful or omnipotent and perfect being. Now, in the rapprochement stage, no longer is the parent kind of idealized all the time, but the child exhibits what's called ambivalence. They have this desire both for independence, but also for closeness with the parent. And this leads to what's called an ambitendency. So an ambitendency describes how a child might appear to angrily reject their primary caretaker in one moment, and then, a few minutes later, they're clinging to them for comfort. This phase is characterized by a kind of fear of abandonment when the parent is not present, but also kind of a pushing away from the parent when the parent is there. The last subphase of separation individuation is called consolidation, and this starts around 2 years of age. By this time, the child has developed this really stable internal representation of the parent and how the parent is separate from them. And so they can separate from the parent with far less anxiety, or at least they can overcome that anxiety much quicker. So they have a stronger sense of self. They have their own identity now. Because of this, they're better able to regulate their own emotions without the parent's help. And this just gets better and better over time. So to conclude this episode, I want to reiterate that all of these approaches to development attempt to describe what is considered kind of normal or the most common. Anyone with a child, for example, who has like severe ADHD might have noticed that The kiddo was far less concerned about where mom was, even during these phases where they're supposed to be screaming and crying if mom's not there. I mean, kiddo might have just wandered away, seemingly without any concern, and they didn't appear to develop any stranger danger at all. So not all children go through these kinds of phases, but these are considered to be typical. Anna Freud and Klein kind of both took Sigmund Freud's primary framework and attempted to apply it to a normally developing child. Anna emphasized environmental influences on development. She emphasized ego defenses, and she really postulated a more primary role for the ego in determining how a child can balance the demands of life. Because of this, Anna Freud was concerned a lot about reinforcing ego strength. Klein, on the other hand, continued to emphasize unconscious processes and developed ideas about object relations and the various ways that infants rely on, reject, identify with, fear the loss of, or are envious of these objects. For Klein, there's this kind of oscillation between paranoid schizoid and depressive positions where children tend to merge their identities with others and then kind of reincorporate that identity into themselves in a changed form. Klein believed that children can be psychoanalyzed basically just like adults, while Freud believed that children did not develop any useful transference to the analyst, so psychoanalysis was not really possible with kids. Instead, she preferred to play with them. Klein was more passive. She wouldn't play with them. She would observe them and then say what she thought. Mahler took object relations and tried to give it a more empirical spin, you might say. She emphasized what she called separation individuation, based on watching children learn how to separate from their mother. So a child slowly, in stages, separates their identity from that of their primary object. So that is the end of the kind of psychosexual approaches or psychoanalytical approaches to child development that I'm going to be covering. There are a lot more of them out there, but I don't have time for all of them. And for the exams, we really just need to hit on some of the major ones. Going forward, I'm going to address some approaches that emphasize the quality of the attachment that an infant develops during their separation individuation, and how a child's temperament, in particular, might affect this attachment and their attachment to other people. But before I get there, I want to discuss some of the alternative ways to categorize and conceptualize child development, starting with Piaget, who paid more attention to children's kind of cognitive abilities, and then onward toward Erikson, who really paid attention a lot to how humans fit in with society. Until then, I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psydactic Child and Adolescent Board Study Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.